So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Mick Cooper for our next talk, who is a Professor of Counselling Psychology at the University of Roehampton.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much, Laura and Polly, for inviting me here. It's been a fantastic conference. And I think, like Neil was saying, it's just been wonderful to hear the voices of young people so integrated into the discussions that we're having. So far, most of the talks from the academics have been about kind of covering quite general areas and looking at a kind of broad spectrum. And what I'm going to do in this talk is focus a bit more specifically on one particular intervention, which is counselling, and talk a bit about what we know about counselling and give a kind of evidence-based critical review. Neil, Richard have already talked about mental health problems in young people in detail, so I won't go into that in depth, but I think we all know the severity of the problems that we're facing and the consequences of mental health problems in children and young people. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to talk a bit about what is school-based counselling. A lot of people hear about counselling in schools, but what actually is it? And then talk about what kind of impact it has and some of the evidence we have on the effects. Something that we've looked at particularly about how might it be helpful if it is helpful, and looking at some of the processes of change, where I think some of the most interesting evidence is. Talk about some of the national developments around counselling, a bit about a trial that we've started doing called the ETHOS study of school-based counselling, and then look at some of the implications for schools, for policymakers and for researchers. So just to start by saying about what is school-based counselling in the UK, and this comes from a review of the evidence that we put together as part of the Counselling Minded project. So school-based counselling has really emerged in the last 10, 15 years or so. There was a kind of increase around the 80s, it went away, it's come back again. In fact, although when we talk about mental health problems, children and young people, school-based counselling doesn't always come up. Much more often we'll talk about CAMS. School-based counselling is one of the most common provisions for mental health problems in young people in the UK. And in this talk I'm going to particularly be talking about young people in secondary schools rather than primary school counselling. Place to be is here if you're interested in that, but I will be focusing on young people. In fact, in Wales and Northern Ireland now, all secondary schools have a school-based counselling service since 2007 for Northern Ireland, 2008 for Wales. Figures are much more patchy for Scotland and England. We think that around 2/3 of schools in England have some form of counselling provision. In Scotland it's about the same, but there was a study recently in the BBC, in fact, that showed that around in 14 areas in Scotland that none of the schools had a counselling service at all. So it does seem to be very patchy, the dissemination of school-based counselling, and there's very little concrete evidence about what kind of provisions there are in schools, and that probably goes more generally, that often we don't really know what kind of mental health provision schools are providing. But based on those figures, we can say that probably around almost just under 100,000 young people come to school-based counselling in the UK. And in England, that figure is around 50 to 70,000. So it's a lot of children. If you remember Richard Laud's figure of 200,000 coming into specialist CAMS, children and young people. So if we just focus on young people, we can see then in the blue that the numbers coming into school-based counselling isn't that dissimilar from the numbers coming into specialist CAMS services. So it is a prevalent intervention, one of the most prevalent mental health interventions in the UK. Now, school-based counselling, what do we mean by counselling? Because counselling can mean quite a lot of things and is used in a very vague, is sometimes used in quite a vague sense. But counselling in the UK, in the schools, tends to be what's called a humanistic or a person-centred or an integrative or a relational intervention. And what that means is it's similar to what's called non-directive supportive therapy, which is a NICE approved intervention for mild depression. So it contrasts with, say, CBT or psychoeducation in the sense that it's less of a kind of an active intervention where the practitioner is maybe delivering input, giving advice, suggesting exercises using a structured, agendaed format. But what you tend to have in this more person-centred approach is more of a space for the young person at their own pace to think through their problems, to find answers for themselves. So the focus is very much on providing a listening ear, that can, not necessarily though kind of tea in sympathy, sometimes people think about counselling as tea in sympathy, it's skilled practitioners, but providing an opportunity for young people to talk through their problems and really to help find their own solutions, rather than say an approach which is more based on some ideas about what may be particularly helpful to the young person. Focus tends to be on emotional problems, but it tends to be quite general. So whereas a number of the interventions that we've talked about today would be focused, say, specifically on depression, on anxiety, counselling tends to be a more kind of broad brush way of working with young people for a range of emotional and interpersonal problems that doesn't necessarily or particularly start with a specific diagnosis. So it tends to be non-diagnostic specific. It also tends to be delivered on a one-to-one basis. So rather than, say, the parents being involved or the family being involved, school-based counselling tends to be just the counsellor and the young person. When it's with younger children, then the counselling may involve more of the family and the parents might be brought in, or there may be additional counselling with the parents. But typically it would just be with the counsellor and the young person. I just wanted to give you an example to try and bring that a bit more to life. So this is a case of Anya, who's a 14-year-old, and obviously it's disguised, and actors will be in the video that I'll show you in a sec. So she's a 14-year-old from central England, referred for missing school. There was a lot of aggressive behaviour, and she talks about experiencing depression. What happened is that her father had had a stroke recently, but rather than that maybe creating a better relationship or more sympathy between Anya and her father, what it had done is really create a lot of tension between them. The father was very vulnerable and he was criticising Anya a lot and was worried about her going out. Consequently, she was feeling very pressurised from the father and feeling that she didn't have much space to talk. She felt very guilty. He'd had his stroke while she was at school and she felt that she should have been there. So she felt very bad about that. And there was a lot of fighting and the stepmom was involved and there was a bad relationship there as well. So I just wanted to play you just a little extract of the counselling, just to give you an example of what counselling tends to look like in this more reflective, empathic focused approach.
I remember I was looking at photos and it was me when I was younger. It was me and him and me and him, and it always used to be like that. And then every Friday he'd take me to the sweet shop and then he'd be like, I don't have enough money to buy you anything. And I'd say, well, I don't want that with you.
You didn't want him to buy you stuff, you just enjoyed spending the time with him, you wanted to have his attention.
Yeah, it means nothing to me.
It's not about the stuff he could or he couldn't buy you. You've mentioned that a few times about how it was the love that was so important, the feeling loved by him, and somehow that's changed and you're not feeling like that.
It feels like I don't get anything from him. It's like he just repeats everything I say. I say, hey look, that's cool, isn't it? And he just goes, yup. And then last night we were watching X Factor, and then the only time he spoke to me was when I spoke to him. And it's like, I just want him to love and cherish me and more stuff like that.
You want to feel loved, you want to feel cherished, and it's not what you're getting from him at the moment, it's just on your case, it's grounding you, telling you what you should do.
Yeah, I want to know why he's ignoring me all the time, and I have asked. I said, why are you ignoring me? Why don't you love me? Even stuff like that, and he just says, oh, shut up, I do love you, I don't ignore you, but he is, I can see it. And then it's like I'm not even there. And then I just get really worried now because he's chain smoking again, and I just get worried because I know for a fact he's going to have another stroke, and I feel like I don't have that much time left before he has another stroke.
And then it becomes even more precious this time that you've got left, and wanting to feel that love from him again, wanting to feel close to him.
That's why I say, you need to talk to me.
So then you can see there that the counsellor is really trying to follow the client's leads, not impose a particular agenda. It was interesting listening to Abby talking earlier, who was saying that she went to see a counsellor and actually the counsellor very much had their own agenda. And Richard Layard was talking about counselling being patchy. That's not, in good counselling, the counsellor really would allow the client to talk about and focus on what is important and what's relevant to them. So just in terms of what we know about school counselling, we know that referrals are mainly through school staff. There's some self-referrals, not that high. Mainly tends to be through the pastoral care team. Often very brief waiting times because the counsellors are based at school, and that means that the young people can be referred to the counsellor and see them very, very quickly. Most are seen within 1 month, which can compare quite starkly with sometimes the waiting list for CAM services. One of the things that's very interesting is that when we look at the levels of distress of young people coming into school counselling, they're often very high, and they're not actually that dissimilar from the ones going into specialist CAM services. So often they won't have a formal diagnosis, but in terms of levels of depression, say on the SDQ, where you say have about a third abnormal, a third at borderline levels, and a third at normal levels, that's a little bit less than what you see in specialist CAMs, but really not that different at all. In terms of the issues, as I said, counselling doesn't tend to be diagnosis-based, and a lot of the issues that people come up with, family issues is a big issue that the children will often talk about. Maybe in that example with Anya about conflicts with the dad is common. Sometimes there's bereavements. You can see that that's quite a common issue. Anger, particularly for boys, is a prevalent issue about just feeling angry a lot of the time in behaviour. Bullying, sometimes people think about school-based counselling as being particularly for school issues, but things like bullying come up a bit of the time, but it tends to be more the young people talking about issues in their families. Self-confidence comes up. This is as recorded by the counsellors. Interestingly, when we ask the young people what their goals are for counselling, then the thing that comes up again and again is that they want to develop their self-confidence. That's the thing that seems to be most important for them in terms of their own personal goals. In terms of gender, we see slightly more girls than boys. Typical age ranges are about 13 and 14, so there tends to be a cluster there, and less so the younger kids, less so the older kids. One thing that we've noticed and we've seen in our data is that young people from black and ethnic minorities tend to be underrepresented in those attending counselling. Interestingly, when the counselling was provided online, they tended to be more representative, but we have seen in our data so far that young ethnic minority kids don't seem to be using it as much as we'd hope them to. So, to go on to say something about is school-based counselling helpful? Well, there's been a number of studies now with over 1,000 cases looking at levels of distress at the beginning of counselling and at the end of counselling. What we see again and again and again is that young people have lower distress when counselling's finished. But of course, we don't really know what that means because we don't know what would happen if they didn't have counselling. So, we might assume that if the young people didn't... So, we see these scores coming down, and if the young people didn't have counselling, then we could say that they seem to be doing pretty well and the counselling having a positive impact. But it could be actually that these young people would improve over time anyway. It might in fact be that they'd improve more if they didn't have counselling, and actually the counselling is holding back on their improvement. And there are some interventions like single session debriefing where, although they do lead to improvement, when they've been compared against people not having the intervention, actually they seem to be making things worse. So looking at interventions in this way, for any intervention, not just counselling obviously, is a really important question. So that leads on to randomised controlled trials, and which is a method that's used across the different therapies to really see whether something's effective or not. And essentially what you do is you randomise young people, in this case counselling, to the intervention. Some get the intervention, some don't. For instance, they might just get pastoral care as usual, they might be put on a waiting list, and then you look at their scores on some measure of mental well-being or diagnosis at the end of the intervention and again at follow-up. Now, if you're going to do something like that, what you need to do is you need to standardise the intervention that's being offered. And Richard Leyer was talking about counselling being patchy. And one of the things we really don't know about is what kind of counselling specifically. We know it's relational, we know it tends to be person-centred, but we know very little about what counsellors are doing. And that makes it very difficult to test it, because then you don't really know what you're testing. So what we've been working on with colleagues at University of Strathclyde and University of Roehampton over the years is to standardise a form of school-based counselling that we've called school-based humanistic counselling, where we try to distill counselling practice in the UK. It's based on competencies that have been developed for humanistic person-centred counselling. And then the young people would receive maybe 10 sessions or so of that intervention. The average number of sessions for young people is about 6 or 7 sessions. So they get up to about 10. And then we can see whether they do better than young people who are receiving pastoral care as usual. So we've now done 4 pilot trials from 2009 to 2014 with around 32 to 64 young people, and this has really helped us look at whether counselling is making a difference or not. What we've seen is that generally, particularly in the short term, although we don't have evidence of longer term effects so far, but certainly in the short term, we're talking about 3 months or so, that counselling does seem to reduce psychological distress and difficulties, and that going to a counsellor also seems to improve self-esteem and young people's attainment of the personal goals. So if we look at something, for instance, the data together on the young person's core, which is a measure of psychological distress, that what we see is the young people who are allocated to counselling, their levels of distress deteriorate. But the key question is what happens to the young people over the same period of time, in this case 6 weeks, where they don't receive counselling. And what we've seen so far is this, that they do improve a little bit, but it's not at the level of the ones who receive the counselling, which would suggest that the counselling is making a positive difference. At the end of counselling, at the end of the intervention, that difference is increased, and the kind of effects we're seeing there are fairly consistent with other psychological interventions. As I was saying, we don't know so much about follow-up, saying 6 months after the assessment. There's some evidence on one study that perhaps the effects decline, and perhaps even more so after that. But that's something that we're looking at that I'll talk a bit about in a minute. We've also done other studies around helpfulness, and other research has been done. For instance, just asking young people or teachers, do they think school-based counselling is helpful? In one study where we did a survey of teachers, what we found is that most rated it as between kind of extremely helpful and neither unhelpful or unhelpful. So fairly helpful, and some were saying it was extremely helpful. And a few who were less supportive of emotional interventions were saying that it wasn't really helpful. Qualitatively, the kind of thing teachers say is that they say that they value the independence of the counsellor, the fact that they don't tend to be someone employed directly by the school as a teacher but come in, and they like the fact that they're kind of outside the teacher network, and young people also say that they're someone with a bit of distance from the school and from the family. They like the confidentiality. Sometimes they get a bit frustrated that the counsellors aren't telling them as much as they'd like to know about what's going on with the young person, but they generally appreciate that the young people need the confidentiality. And a lot, not all, but a lot of young people say that the confidentiality is really important in them being able to talk. They like the fact that it's accessible, and I think that would go for any mental health intervention really based in a school, and the value of having someone there on site, we really see that in the counselling data. They like the fact that the counsellors have an expertise, and they often feel that they don't quite have the expertise to listen and talk to young people in the way the counsellor does. And a lot of what the teachers say is that they just like the fact that the counsellor has time. That what I've seen in the pastoral care team and teachers is an enormous commitment, and I think we've heard that from some of our young people, to really be supporting young people and around emotional issues. But often teachers just don't have the time in their incredibly busy schedules to be there for the young people in the way that they'd like to be. So having a counsellor that they know can be there for an hour a week, say for 7-8 weeks, is really valuable for them. In terms of area for improvement, they talk about things like wanting more availability of counsellors, more promotion, better communication. This was something that came up earlier by one of the young people, that if you're going to have counsellors, they need to be talking to the schools about what's going on. And sometimes they can get a bit siloed and a bit isolated from the schools, and also from other mental health services. And I think one of the challenges we have in the field at the moment is how we integrate interventions like counselling, universal interventions, CAMS, so that these professionals are working together, because it's really frustrating for children. We have a lot of evidence on that, when the interventions aren't talking to each other and children have to repeat themselves when they see new people. Some of the teachers and also some of the young people also talk about the value of having more interventions. As I was saying, counselling tends to be a process of sitting and listening and talking. And for some young people, want something a bit more active. They want someone who's going to make suggestions, who's going to offer advice, who's going to do something a bit more dynamic. And teachers also, Neil was talking about some of these universal interventions. I think sometimes teachers would like to see the counsellors acting more broadly and being able to facilitate groups rather than just doing the one-to-one work. Some of the research we've done is also looking at the process of change. This is quite a complex slide, and I won't go through it in depth, but it's been really interesting to do a number of studies which rather than just looking at the quantitative outcomes, talk to young people about what they find helpful. And again, I think we've really heard that in the young people today, not just in counselling, but in many different interventions, that what young people say is just having that space to talk about what's genuinely going on for them, about their genuine concerns and issues, is a really important resource to have in a school, somewhere where you can talk to somebody about what's really going on in you. Things counsellors do that young people say is helpful to facilitate that is to listen, to be empathic, to encourage them to talk about their emotions, and other things like being trustworthy is really important. And what we found is kind of 5 things that does in terms of what the outcomes are. First, there's just a sense of relief. In our research, we get a sense that there's a lot of young people carrying a lot of emotional things as they go from school to go day to day in school that can really get in the way then of their learning and well-being. And having a counsellor you can just get these things off your chest to, and young people often say the value of getting things off your chest is really important. So that's one thing. Secondly, they develop relational skills when they talk about things, because they realise that they can that it is possible to talk about their experiences. And that they can then take that out and do that with their friends and family. And in fact, with Anya, when she talked about what was helpful, the most important thing was she learned to talk about what she was really feeling, about her fears, and then she could talk to her dad. And by talking to her dad, that seemed to help things. Self-acceptance, that if you're talking about your problems to somebody who's empathic and accepting and listening, then what that can do is help you feel less ashamed about it and more accepting yourself. And also, there's a process of understanding and developing insight so you can change what you do. But also, interestingly, even though this intervention is intended to be non-directive, what a lot of the young people say is that they really value the advice that they're given. And they value the guidance of the counsellor. And that's even where a counsellor is actually not supposed to be doing that or not trying to do that. So I think there's clearly a place also for more active psychoeducational interventions that can work alongside space. Yeah, there's a real sense in which young people, I think, need the space to talk. And if there's advice too soon, it can shut the young person down. But if an adult is listening and empathic and understanding, then there's a really valuable place for it. Young people also, something else that's coming out in the research is young people talk about the importance of just having time to build that relationship. That, that if you're just seeing somebody for 5 minutes, you can't necessarily trust them and feel you can talk about everything. One young person said, I brought up something that I never told anyone. So it just goes to show how much the relationship's changed over time. Because I never trusted anyone with it, and then I trusted the counsellor. So, sometimes young people need time, maybe 5-6 hours, to really be able to talk about things that are difficult and challenging for them. I think another way of thinking about counselling is thinking about it as an intervention for young people who maybe don't have anyone else to talk to. That what we've seen in our research when we looked at the SDQ across schools is that you might have a school with, say, 1,000 young people in it. And of those 1,000 young people, maybe 600 our research would suggest have an emotional concern, something they're worried about. Now, not all of those want to talk about it. Maybe only 300 or so we found in our research were saying, actually, I'd like to talk to somebody about this emotional concern. Now, that 300, a lot of them are going to have people to talk to. They're going to be really happy to talk to their parents, talk to their GP, talk to a teacher. But there is also a small minority, maybe 60 or so across that 1,000, who actually don't have someone to talk to. As we heard one of the young people saying earlier, that they didn't want to talk to their parents. Often young people feel that their parents have enough problems, that they don't want to burden them with more problems. Or maybe they don't get on with their teacher and feel that there isn't a teacher there. There's clearly young people in schools who don't feel that there is anyone that they can talk to. And one thing that counselling does, and I don't think it has to be a counsellor, but one thing a counsellor does, which I think is fairly unique at the moment, is provide young people with a trusted relationship where they can begin to talk about what's going on. And I think young people need that. Who provides it is the question. Just to wrap up, just something about some recent development. So based on some of the research that we've done, we've gone on to create competencies for counsellors working with young people. And if you're interested, you can look at these competencies. A lot of it was drawn from the CAMS competencies, working in specialist CAM services. That led us to develop some e-learning training, and that was mentioned before. Neil, I think, mentioned about Minded, and we had a specific counselling component of that, counselling Minded. The BACP, the main counselling organisation, then developed a framework for young people based on the competencies, which included counselling minded. So they set up a kind of broad framework curriculum for training counsellors working with young people. And perhaps one of the most significant developments, though, is that Children and Young People's IAP then went ahead and have developed a specific training for counsellors working with young people. What that training does is that, as well as training counsellors to work in empathic and relational ways, that the training also for the first time includes a CBT component, which Shirley helped to develop with us. And what that means is that, as well as the counsellors being equipped to help young people talk about their problems, talk through the issues, that they're also developing specific skills to tackle anxiety disorders, an area where counselling and talking approaches tend to be less well evidenced. We also saw before that the Department of Education has published advice on counselling, and if you're interested in thinking about counselling services, do have a look at that DFE advice, including the strong expectation that over time all schools will make counselling services available to their pupils. Just to say, there's still a few things missing though in this story. One is that we still don't really have definitive evidence of effectiveness, particularly in the long term. There's not a lot of research about cost effectiveness, although there is research on effectiveness. And again, we're beginning to understand the process of change, but there's a lot more that we can learn there. So what I've been working on with colleagues at Roehampton University and across a number of different institutions is a project called ETHOS, which is the first fully powered trial of school-based counselling, funded mainly by the ESRC, which will be randomly allocating young people to either counselling, school-based humanistic counselling, or pastoral care as usual. We'll be doing quantitative outcomes, we'll be doing qualitative interviews with the parents, with the young people, with the teachers, by NCB. And that will really give us the best insight yet into what counselling looked like. We started recruiting back in last year, and we're now up to over 200 of our 300 kids. So we're hoping to finish recruitment by the end of this academic year, and then the results of this study will be out for 2019. So just to finish, just to talk about a few implications. So I think for schools, the main thing that I'd like to kind of get across really is that I think schools need to think about how do you ensure that all young people in your school have someone to talk to. As I say, I don't think that has to be a counsellor, but I think you can be guaranteed that there are young people in your school who have issues going on where they would like to have some time to talk to someone. If they had that time, they would be talking about the things that were going on. And I think that's a question for schools about how do you ensure that no child is without a skilled adult with the time to really listen to them. Think about appointing a school-based counsellor. I think there's probably enough evidence to support that it seems to be helpful. Certainly both the qualitative and the quantitative together suggest that it seems to be doing something good for a broad spectrum of emotional and interpersonal problems. If you do have a counsellor, then it's important that they're doing some kind of evidence-based practice. There is a real range of practices, and they need to be doing something where there's some evidence and also monitoring the outcomes. That was talked about earlier, the importance that they're actually looking at the outcomes so that you can see if that's helpful or not. And ensuring that it's part of a wider integrated service provision. For commissioners and policymakers, I think it's really the same question that I would start with is how do you ensure that every young person in your area has somebody that they can talk to? How do you make sure that no child is left alone with their problems without having some skilled person that they can explore that with? Consider commissioning counselling can be a useful provision, I think, but it needs to be integrated within a wider service provision and not on its own as it sometimes happens. And again, I think that the Children and Young People's IAP programme, the evidence-based counselling practice course, which is a postgraduate certificate, provides a really excellent way now of training up counsellors to be working in schools in a way where they have the skill set that can help young people with a range of problems. And finally, just for researchers, there's a whole range of questions that come up around school-based counselling. I won't go through all of them, but things like, is it effective for different kinds of client groups? What might be unhelpful about school-based counselling and how can it be improved? What kind of client group may it most be helpful for? Is it more helpful, for instance, for girls or boys or for children who need and want to talk about problems, maybe less so for kids who want specific solutions? We have a lot of data that we're generating in ETHOS. If people are interested in it, then they can email us and we can talk about the possibilities of people accessing the data obviously with the right conditions in place so that they can do analysis of some of the findings when they're available. Also looking at other forms of school-based counselling and considering the research on primary school counselling and how counselling can integrate into a wider framework. So, thank you very much. I hope that's given you an idea of school-based counselling and what we know.
Fabulous, Mick. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Any questions in the audience for Mick?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Flasher, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm interested in evidence-based interventions, so clearly in the SPIRE group there is less evidence-based than there is in adults. Firstly, we're not sure what counsellors are doing across the range, despite the fact they're seeing 60,000 children a year. That's a bit of a worry. Mild depression is the nice guidelines, but we know that CBT is most effective for anxiety disorders in children. Any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a rough idea of what the counsellors. We don't have a specific idea of what the counsellors are doing. We have a rough idea that what most of them will be trained. We know their trainings, so they'll be mainly trained in person-centred and integrative approaches and relational approaches. I think there's certainly a need to kind of develop a greater understanding of it and to standardise it more and to bring it in line with the evidence-based approaches. I think one of the things about NICE guidelines, I mean, there are NICE guidelines, obviously, depression and anxiety, but as I was saying, a lot of the children who come to counselling service aren't necessarily coming with a specific diagnosis. And many of the problems that they're facing are things for which there aren't specific NICE guidelines. And Neil was talking about that in his presentation. So for this kind of broad spectrum, levels of psychological distress that many of the young people that come to counselling are, the evidence for counselling is as good as it is for other kinds of intervention. So, CBT is obviously evidence for specific anxiety disorders, but that's as proportion of the children that come to us. So I think we need to develop more evidence in the area as a whole, both for counselling and for other approaches, and what can work with this broad spectrum of kind of subclinical population that obviously is very important to work with as a way of trying to stop problems later on.
One quick one.
Hi, Claire Stafford from the Charlie Waller Memorial Trust. Isn't it more important to have a therapeutic relationship between the young person and whoever they're with and whatever they're delivering? Isn't that sort of more important than what particular modality is being delivered?
Well, that's what the kids tend to say. I mean, when we interview young people, that's the thing that comes up again and again and again, is that they really talk about the relationship. And we know from the evidence base that the therapeutic alliance is one of the best predictors of outcomes. I guess how that weighs against other kinds of other factors like technique factors. We know in the adult field that we can compare it. In the child field, there's less evidence, and I guess that's why we need to know more about the evidence. Certainly, a lot of the counselling interventions is based on the idea that a relationship is really important, and because so many of the challenges that kids have are relational challenges, it seems to make sense to think that that relational way of working is so critical. And kids say things like, she was so lovely, the counsellor, and I think when they see CBT practitioners, be interested to look at what they say is helpful in CBT practitioners or other forms of therapy, because I suspect that a lot of what they find helpful there is not just the relationship, but I'm sure that plays an important part as well. Thanks.
Brilliant. I think we're out of time for questions now, but of course you can put some in the Ask It basket and on Twitter as well. Great.
Thank you.